So we'll start going. So welcome everyone to the World Federalist Movement Canada Montreal branch event. We're welcoming Nigel Roulet today to speak about the future of the environment. For those of you who don't know the World Federalists, we're an organization a nonprofit, and our focus is on research, education, and advocacy in the areas of peace and security, global democratization, responsibility to protect, and global governance reforms. And of course, climate change and the environment is one of our focuses, and we all want to know more about that. I'm not going to make a long introduction, but just if you have any questions or anything about the World Federalists, if you keep it to the end of the presentation, we'll be glad to answer any questions you have. And I know there's many members here, but there are people who also are not members, so you're very welcome to have joined us. Okay, so Nigel is the chair of the geography department at McGill. He said he didn't like long introductions, so I'm not going to make a long introduction, but he has had experience over a long period of time with the issues of climate change, and I'm going to turn it over to him. Nigel?
Okay, thank you very much. We've been using Zoom a lot. So if you have any questions, I don't follow the chat while I'm giving a talk or a lecture because it's near impossible to do that. But if you do use the reaction button and raise your hand, I will see that on my screen, and I'm quite happy to stop if somebody has a question in the middle of the talk. So it won't throw me off. Okay, so this talk is one I've given to a number of groups. It was originally given as part of the McGill bicentennial celebrations, where there was a mini science series that was the future of a bunch of different things, and they approached me and said, could I talk on the future of the environment? And I thought, well, that's interesting, and made me think about things. I have been teaching environmental science, geography for over 30 years now, and all my research has been in the area. Primarily, I'm a physical geographer, and I've done a lot of research on climate and its interaction with ecosystems. But this is a generalist talk about based on my years of experience working with the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, working for some federal or being on some federal commissions, some on provincial commissions on environment and climate. So, okay. Can everybody see see the screen?
I cannot.
You cannot see the screen? My
No,
slides?
I can only see myself.
Oh, okay.
That's very interesting.
I can see your screen, Nigel.
Okay, all right. Well, I'll hopefully you can work your problems out and you can see the screen. So basically what I'm going to do is I'm going to talk a little bit about some general ideas about environment and how we conceptualize that. And then I'm going to look back over the last 2 centuries. Because I did this talk originally from McGill, I used kind of McGill and the history of McGill in correspondence to some environmental changes and indicators to kind of assess where we're at. And I get up to the 1970s, where it was the first Earth Day. And then I'll look at some successes and failures of fairly big environmental issues that we've had over the lifetime of my career, and try and point out why all environmental problems aren't equal. Then I'm going to talk a little about the everything up problem, and you'll see why I use that term. And then a little bit about contemporary climate change. So climate change kind of runs through this whole theme, and then I'll give us a few ideas about are we on track to resolve the current mess. I need to confess right up front, I believe we are in a pickle. I think that we have really left it way too late to get on the ball and to get behind these things to be able to resolve them. And so you'll see at the end of the talk, I think we're going to be dealing with the simultaneously three problems of mitigation, adaptation, and also the consequences of climate change at the same time. We're going to have to deal with those. I don't think if any of you follow the news, you will know that the future environment is here already in terms of our dealing with certainly extreme weathers and climate change. We had spectacular fires in Western Canada. This is the town of Lytton, and at the same time, we had some pretty severe droughts on the prairies. The hurricanes are getting much stronger than they were before, not more frequent, but stronger. And so these are two pictures from Louisiana and also from New York City. And then Texas had the deep freeze, and you can go on and go on with examples of this. In literature, they portray the environment in a pretty dystopian view. About it, though some of you might recognize The Road, a few science fiction books of The Postman, Kim Stanley Robinson, who's one of my favorite authors. Those of you that are Soylent Green fans will recognize the picture on the bottom, and our own Canadian Margaret Atwood. The literature on utopian futures that are nice, where the environment isn't really a problem, are pretty hard to find, but there are a few of them out there that portray a kind of green technology future that everything has been resolved. But the reality is usually somewhere in between, and this fact is that we've got this we tend to pitch it as a dichotomy that we're either going to have a disaster or we're going to be very green in the future. And I think our future is going to be somewhat brownish, not greenish, but hopefully we'll get it as green as we possibly can and move forward. Environment, the question is, what do we define as environment? It's one of those words that we use all the time, and then when you push students to define it, or I'm sure if I did the poll here on the talk, we would have a lot of different answers for what environment is. You can look up a strict dictionary definition of environment, which looks at water, air, and land in or on which people, animals, and plants live. I tend to have a little bit more holistic view than a straight definition of this. My research has been steeped in kind of systems theory and thinking about systems. The environment, in my mind, is a very complex system, and humans are embedded in the middle of that environment. Environment isn't separate from us. There are natural components to that system and societal components that drive the economy. So these are two representations. The one from the Stockholm Resilience Center is actually the sustainable development goals separated out that way, and what we call the sustainable development pie. But the environment is a very complex entity that we work with, and that's part of the problem, that humans aren't very good at dealing with complex systems. So I'd like to go back to the future a little bit. McGill was founded in 1821. We start off before McGill at the turn of the century. We find the population of the world is under actually 1 billion at that point in time. The mean annual temperature is about 0.2 degrees below the average of the 1970 to 1990 temperature. We have no noticeable contributions to the atmosphere from fuels up here. Coal has started to produce some, and we're basically coming out of the in the Holocene, where the CO2 concentrations were around about 280 parts per million. If we advance forward now to when McGill was founded in 1821 to 1839, when they built the first arts building at McGill, the population has increased slightly. The temperatures are still hovering around 0.2 or 0.3 below the average temperatures that we experienced recently. You can just start seeing the fossil fuels, and you could just start seeing the CO2 change. And the CO2 change that you see here is largely driven by land use change and a little bit by the use of coal. We proceed through to when the Roddick Gates were built at the front of McGill University, which is 1925. By that point in time, we're up to almost 2 billion people. Still, we haven't seen any really effect of temperature increasing. We do see now the solid fraction of fuels going up, some liquid fuels here, and we're seeing an appreciable increase of CO2 and other greenhouse gases. And in fact, now in 1925, CO2 went over 300 parts per million. And then if we go to 1971, that's when the building that I'm in, which is, I never lose any visitors that come to McGill because I just tell them to go inside the Roddick Gates and look for the ugliest building, and they always manage to show up at Burnside Hall. Now the population up here, we're heading towards 4 billion people. We now actually see the temperatures are hovering around the average condition that we had in the 1970s to the 2000 here. So they've gone up about 0.2 to 0.3 degrees C. Fossil fuels are being burned a number of in the liquid form, the gas form, and coal is still pretty prominent. And CO2 has gone up to 350 greenhouse gas has gone up to that. CO2 is now about 320, 330. So I picked this time because this is right around the first Earth Day, which was when millions of people began to start thinking that we had serious problems on Earth. My favorite philosopher, Pogo, those of you that are old enough to follow Pogo will maybe remember this cartoon. This actually isn't the original cartoon. This one has been, color's been put on it. It was black and white when it came out. We have met the enemy and he is us, Pogo. And he was not really thinking about climate change. He was actually thinking about garbage and water pollution at the time. That stimulated a whole bunch of things, which I think are successes that we should think about first. And the one that I think is really prominent is the protecting humans from persistent organic pollutants. And the one that most people know about is DDT, but there's a whole bunch of them. We call them POPs. Rachel Spring's book, Silent Spring, certainly started the movement going. There was a crisis with the eagles in the sense of the reproduction, but with the peregrine falcons, the same thing happened. And Canada got rid of most of its DDT after 1972 and deregistered it in 1985. But we were part of the Stockholm Convention, and we really have made significant advances on persistent organic pollutants. We are introducing all those new pesticides in, and but we are, I would say that's one of our environmental success stories. Another one, when I was an undergraduate, was eutrophication. At that point in time, this lake, Lake Erie, was thought to be a dead lake. That's actually a misnomer. The problem was that Lake Erie was too alive, and all the organic algae that in the blooms that we had in the lake would drop down to the bottom sediments and then decompose, and that would make the lake go anoxic, which meant it wouldn't support fish. And that's why it was referred to being dead, because it wouldn't provide the fish. But as far as overall productivity, and there was a bunch of experiments done in northeastern Ontario in the area, a lake called Experimental Lakes area, where I worked very soon after my PhD. And this is a very famous picture on Lake 226. There was a bunch of lakes that people are allowed to work on. And in this case, you see a curtain that goes across here, this side of the lake was provided with the nutrients of nitrogen and phosphorus. This side of the lake was only provided with nitrogen, and you can see the algal blooms on this side. And that's where we really worked out that phosphorus was one of the major problems that happened. This is Lake Erie in 2011, and every 3 or 4 years we get some severe algal blooms. The input of phosphorus to these lakes now is greatly reduced. I think I've got a diagram here, that shows the inputs of phosphorus to Lake Erie starting in 1967 when they measured it. And you can see the bars have dropped down quite significantly. The different colors are where the pollutants are coming from. And the big thing is that we've reduced the point source pollution going into Lake Erie. We've done that to all the Great Lakes. And that's because we've now got secondary treatment plants on most urban environments. The non-point source pollutants, which are what comes from agriculture and various different other things, have been reduced with better land management, leaving in buffer zones and things like this, but we still have a significant amount of phosphorus going into the system. However, one of the things we know is that most of the phosphorus that we're seeing causing the algal blooms these days is phosphorus that's in the lake and is in the sediments from previous time, and it gets recycled. And this is one of the dynamics of complex systems, is that they tend to operate within different regimes over time, so they can flip back and forth. So the phosphorus issue in Lake Erie and many of the Great Lakes will exist probably for decades and maybe even a century or so before we get all the phosphorus out of the system and get it back to a reasonable shape. But certainly there's a demonstrated reduction in phosphorus and algal blooms. Then we had in the acid rain era after that, where we had these, again, this is up in the La Crosse range in Northern Ontario up by Sudbury. When I was 20 years ago, 30 years ago, when we did a lot of canoeing up there, we could see tens of meters in the lakes because the acid rain had eliminated most of the algae. The two constituents were the NOx, or what we call the oxides of nitrogen and sulfur. And the Clean Air Act came in place by these two individuals, which is very interesting because most people would trash both these people not being particularly environmentally conscious individuals. But in fact, these two individuals were probably the most environmentally conscious leaders in Canada and the United States to actually get things done, which was the Clean Air Act, which significantly reduced acid rain. We're not out of the woods, but we've significantly reduced acid rain, and particularly the nitrous oxides we've reduced substantially. These are examples of the reductions that have happened in the emissions. So if you look at North America on here, which is the blue, you'll see that there's a reduction here. Worldwide, we have a reduction going on, but East Asia now is the predominant supplier of these pollutants. And so if we now look at a map of the world, we would find acid rain being a serious problem in Asia, India, and those areas there, and not so much anymore in Europe and North America because of the clean air legislation. So there's some common elements to these environmental problems, which I think result in us having some success on them, is that the cause and effect of these was relatively easy to identify, or at least it appeared so at the time. So if you take acid rain, there's a very good example that we know that about 95% of the sulfur emissions in North America came from 27 coal-fired generating systems and smelters. And once the technology was developed to trap that sulfur, even though the company screamed and yelled about doing it, it actually substantially reduced the emissions to the atmosphere. And in fact, it turns out to be an economic bonus because that sulfur now is being trapped and is now being sold, and it's paying for it. There was also in these things the direct connection to people. So the causes, concern, or negative consequences people experience. So in the acid rain, again, is an example there. It was, for example, the cottagers that were really, really concerned about their lakes going downhill. That was also eutrophication was really driven by cottagers and being quite concerned about those things. Ozone and the ozone depletion of the ozone layer was a real concern because people were very scared about it because it was attached to cancer. People thought it was attached to cancer. And the nature of these problems were fairly simple problems with relatively simple solutions. And I mean comparatively. So the example I'm using about sulfur reduction was you had a few mega polluters. The CFC issue was DuPont was the major producer of CFCs and actually stopped producing them. They are producing other CFCs now. And so the sources were few, so we were able to kind of get ahead of these. But that's not necessarily the case for most of the environmental problems that we're really concerned about. So if you go on the web, you can do this yourself. You just go on the web and you type in what are the top 10 environmental issues, and you'll come up with a bunch of lists, but you'll usually find these 10 on here: air and water pollution, biodiversity conservation, land use change, food and water insecurity, climate change, ocean acidifications, plastics, ozone depletion, acid deposition, and eutrophication. I talked about these here. These two are the one, or the climate change is the one that we are really focusing on now. That's not to say the other ones are not serious problems. And they're all tied in. I mean, food, water security is definitely related to climate change. Land use change is one of the major drivers of climate change. Biodiversity and conservation has a significant effect on climate change. And if we look at those ones, those bigger problems we look at, what makes these problems different from the acid rain and the eutrophication? Well, the first one is that they're complex problems with multiple interactions and feedback. So it's very difficult for us to get a handle on this. Sometimes the cause and effect are not that clear. The solutions are not easy or clear. And the general rule is that uncertainty is much higher than what we're used to. And I think why this is the case is that we really have not developed a keen scientific insight to these problems and also the social science dimension to them. We generally like to think the world is a mechanistic type of world. We tend to think of it in terms of Newtonian physics. And so there's law-like structures. But the problem is that once you start dealing with something like the Earth's climate system, you're dealing with an awful lot of complexity in there. So as the complexity goes up, the uncertainty goes up. And so people are very, very uncomfortable about doing things where we don't have, 100% proof, even though those of you that have done philosophy out there will realize that's not possible. But the uncertainty is much larger, and we've got to move before all the answers are in, and we're very uncomfortable doing this. The second is that resolving them will require new approaches. We're what we call wicked problems, in the sense that there's not a nice linear path. We like to have really good engineering management schemes to be able to do things. And this really has to be much more trial and error on a lot of different things on a lot of different paths. And that requires us to look at our governance structure. It requires us to really look at our economics. And it really has us to look at our tolerances as a society for us to test things out. We don't need to go any further than look at our reaction to COVID over this to realize that that's a similar type of problem. The climate change problem is a multi-generational or many-generational problem. And this is a serious one because what we're asking is that some of the impacts are immediate right now, but the problem is really a long-term problem. So much of the CO2 that we're dealing with that is causing climate change right now has been emitted over the last 30 years or so. The other thing too is that we're dealing with a carbon cycle on Earth that has a long residual memory. So even if we were to reduce our emissions to zero today, we would still be dealing with the climate change problem for another at least century or more, but longer than that, but the serious problems with it. And the benefits of acting are not seen by us in the sense that we could now act on this, but it's really our children and their children's children that are going to see the benefits of this. So in the way that we operate, in the way we think about our economic structures and our governance, you're actually extending rights to future generations that don't exist now. And you're asking the current generation to make the sacrifice. So I think many of you that belong to this organization think that that is exactly the way we should operate. But I would say that I would posit the argument that it's not. Certainly we haven't demonstrated that this is the way that we operate. The other thing too is that it really does take individual and collective actors are important. Everybody needs to reduce their environmental footprint. And this kind of really drives me a bit nuts by teaching at university all the time, because our students are very, very passionate. They really want to see emission reductions. But then when you say, well, what is it we should do? They said, oh, what we got to do is we've got to get the oil companies to stop emitting. Yes, there is a very large footprint with the oil companies producing the fuels that we consume. But we do a lot of emissions while we consume the very products that they produce. And so there's no magic bullet of going after one individual portion of the sectors of the economy to be able to do this. It means we all have to reflect on our environmental footprints. And if we stop demanding things and use energy less, then there'll be far less requirement to be able to produce that energy. And we might be able to find alternate ways to produce that energy. So this is a diagram that I always show in my introductory class, and it's called the everything up diagram. I only, over on this side here, what you see is the social economic trends. And over here, you see the Earth system trends. These are usually responses to what's happening over here. So population, real GDP, urban population, fertilizer use, large dams, water use, they're all going up, and they're all going up exponentially. And as a consequence of those actions, the greenhouse gases of carbon dioxide, nitrogen oxide, and methane are going up. Stratospheric ozone, the reduction of this stratospheric ozone, surface temperatures, ocean acidification is related to the CO2 that we're putting in here, tropical forest loss, domestic land use change, biospheric degradation. The diagram that Stefan produced here actually has about 100 panels on it. I only just put the first set on here. So this is one of the major problems, is that our consumption is really, really going up, and our use of these materials and the consequences and the byproduct of that consumption are also going up. We now are thinking of this in terms of what we call planetary boundaries, and that's thinking about the capacity of the Earth to be able to cope with the amount of degradation that we're doing in the system right now. I talked about nitrogen and phosphorus, and we are well beyond the limits of the Earth to be able to handle this. The human beings now fix more nitrogen than nature does in total, which is pretty scary if you think about this. Other land use change, climate change, I think many people would argue we're in the red zone on these, or not just this. So this is a way of thinking about the Earth as being a finite system, and thinking about the boundaries and the capacity of the system to be able to absorb this. So now if we look at McGill in 2021, which is what we were asked to think about the third century on this, these are the projections for population right now, 8 billion. We're just about to get there. There is some real suggestion, because of a demographic transition, that we'll get to about 10 billion, 11 billion or so. That projection is, most people think that that's kind of where we're going to end up, not the projection of 16 or 18 billion on Earth. The problem with this, though, is that we've got an economic transition that's going on at the same time, where much more of the population is becoming middle class, and the consumption habits related to middle class. You don't need to look at China to see what happens there. If we look at the possible future uses of fossil fuel emissions, the gray here and the black is what we've been doing in emissions now. We're putting out about 8 what are called petagrams of carbon. That's 10 to the 15 grams of carbon a year. And these are the scenarios for the future, the projections for the future, the way we're going to go. And this is the concentration of CO2 that would be in the atmosphere by 2100 if we follow these. So you look at these, and the red one is, of course, the worst case scenario. I have to laugh at this, having been on the IPCC for many, many years. We kept calling it the worst case scenario. We actually should refer it to a reality. That is the trajectory that we are on now. That's the trajectory on now. And all these other trajectories here are trajectories we would like to be on if we do various different mitigation strategies that we happen. This trajectory right here is the trajectory we need to be on to avoid to get us to only 1.5 to 2 degrees C increase in temperature. So these are the various different CO2 concentrations, which would go up to over 900 parts per million. We're now just over 400. We're about 425 now. 600, that would get us to about 450. And this would actually be slightly below where we are now if we actually could follow this trajectory. And if we look at that, we look at the temperatures that are associated with that. The red course is the one that we're on right now. And we would look at that, we're looking at temperatures that are going to be somewhere around about 4 degrees C above what they were in the 1950s, which is pretty scary when you think about it. If we went on this blue trajectory, this is where we would get off, and we've come off at about 100 degrees, or about 1 degree, 1.5 degrees. This is the uncertainty with all the different models that we use to do the projection. So what does that mean? I mean, I could go through a litany of impacts of climate change. I don't think I need to do that because I think many of you are aware of these because you're seeing them daily in the newspaper. But one that baffles most people is sea level rise. The sea level is going up for a number of reasons. Sea level is going up because of the glacial melt, the ice melt that's going on. But it's also going up because as ocean water gets warmer, it thermally expands. So these are the projections for the increase in by 2080 to 2021 by the IPCC increase in sea level. And you see here that they're predicting 0.6 to 0.7 meter increase in sea level over what it was in 2000. You may think, well, that's not really that bad. But if we look at, there's this nice little, I think it will come up here. Yeah, you can go on your web and check this out, and you can do any place in the world, and it'll let you look at the sea level rise, put in the sea level rise, and it'll project what areas are flooded. So some of you may recognize this place over here. This is Vancouver. And all the red are the areas that will be inundated, by the time of 2080 that we would see inundated. This is Bangladesh over here. And this is another area that many of you may know about, which is Northern Europe and the lowlands in the Fen district, which is in England, the Low Countries. There's an awful lot of this, and it's projected that with the sea level rise that we're already committed to, now, it'll be somewhere between 190 million to 630 million people will have to move because of the area that they're in will be inundated sufficiently that they will not be able to live there. So what are we going to do to solve this, or what do we have to do to solve this? So many of you know about the Paris Accord. There was much to do about it. There was a scientific report that the IPCC was involved in 2018 to say what we needed to do. These are the trajectories of the temperature increase, and this is the blue one here that we need to do to get us out to within this 1.5 to 2 degrees C range. So this is a little different than everything I've shown you so far. Before, what I've done is that we put the greenhouse gases in, we put land use change, we put all those things in the models, and we run them forward and get them to project what would happen with climate change. In this case, what the analysis was done was to go and say, okay, if we say that 1.5 degrees C is acceptable, and that is a value statement, that's not a scientifically justified number, it's 1.5 we chose, or 2 degrees C, then what we do is we run the models backwards. We run the models backwards and say, what is it that you would need to do to be able to get the temperatures within that range and to stabilize? What are the concentrations in the atmosphere that we need to stabilize at to achieve that goal? And this is where the rubber really hits the road. So I've just put a couple of this one up here. This is our current rate of emissions in 2010. This is in billions of tons of CO2 per year equivalent. So that's where we're at right now. All these gray lines and the blue superimposed on it are a whole bunch of trajectories and scenarios that were run in the models that satisfied that criteria of by 2100 having no more than 1.5 degrees C increase in temperature. So if you look at these trajectories here, this is really where the truth hits. This is 2050. What we have to do is we have to reduce our emissions. So it's up 40 now. We could do emissions in the order of about 4 billion tons of CO2 by 2050. So that means within the next 30 years, we somehow have to figure out how to reduce our emissions that amount. There's a whole bunch of all these lines that you see on here are the different trajectories of combinations of reducing oil, reducing coal, increasing nuclear power, carbon capture, increasing carbon capture, all these various different things. I've just listed over here. I mean, all this means that we need a 90% reduction in CO2 emissions. We need to do that. The assumption here is that we would not seriously affect the economy to do this, was you would need at least a 60% increase in electricity, a 70% decrease in the use of coal, oil, and gas, 150% increase in electricity produced by nuclear power, huge increases in biofuels and carbon capture is all the rage. We have been able to demonstrate that carbon capture can work, but we have not figured out at all how to do this at scale and do it make it economically viable. And a huge reduction in agricultural emissions of methane and nitrous oxide are required to do this. So we have to get a lot smarter in our agriculture, and we have to get off fossil fuels and on the alternate forms of energy. Now, of course, you could do substantial amounts, and there are built in here substantial amounts of increase in efficiency in everything we do, but this is still a pretty big thing to do. So we are those alternate energies. We do have hydroelectric, particularly in Quebec. We're doing very well on this, but reservoirs have severe environmental consequences too. In northern Quebec, the issue is well known with mercury and mercury pollution with this. Both wind turbines and solar has been proven to be economically viable, but they also require a huge amount of land, and that's a real problem. This is just by my cottage, in fact, which is the background that you see here. We're on Lake Huron. We're about 20 kilometers further south of this. This is the new Bruce nuclear power plant. Nuclear power is effectively a green nuclear power as far as greenhouse gases are concerned. But I'm sure most of you know the problems with disposal of nuclear waste and and it would be around for a very long period of time. This is in Iceland. Iceland's a great place for carbon capture because you remove the CO2 out of the atmosphere. And the black nodules you see in here is in fact carbon CO2 being fixed in basalt. And there's a huge amount of basalt in Iceland that we can fix. There's a lot talking about natural climate solutions. So again, it's land intensive, grow trees. It's been suggested that we might be able to take up somewhere around about 100 petagrams of carbon in trees, but this is very land intensive. Then alternate fuels, the biofuels, but I wouldn't get conned in the biofuel area. I mean, there's a lot of stories. The United States is very big on ethanol and corn ethanol, but it is totally bogus as far as reducing greenhouse gas emissions. The fact is that you've got to transport the corn to the ethanol plant, and for it to be carbon neutral, you'd need to have an ethanol plant about every 40 square kilometers in the United States to actually make it an economically viable or a greenhouse gas viable option to do that. Now, the people in the corn lobby in the United States would argue that a great deal, but that seems to be the case. So everybody made a big deal about Glasgow and the COP26 that happened in November. A lot of fanfare that went on. I mean, one of the things of being involved in the IPCC you feel a little guilty about is how much fossil fuels we actually do by having these meetings, and people are questioning. So if we're looking at the global temperatures that we want to, or we're going to get to, and we start out with all the policies and actions, real world, that are happening right now, we're looking at, on average, a 2.7 degree increase, with a high of 3.62. If we look at the 2030 targets that people suggested there, it would get it down to 2.4 degrees C. The pledges and all targets that people were asking for would get us down to 2.1. And the optimistic scenario is 1.8. This optimistic scenario is based on us running the models backwards and saying what we need to do. So this is much closer to reality than this. This is science fiction. This is much closer to reality, and it could be even worse. So I give this, if I'm a professor, I like to give grades. I would, coming out of Glasgow, I'd give the world kind of nations an F for what they accomplished. And this is the task that we're looking at here. This is the historical emissions that are going on here. And this is the trajectory to get us down by 2030 that we have to do. This is astronomical. The question is, how do we reduce this to get us to 1.5 degrees C? These are the trajectories that look at for those different current policies right now that are out here. This gets us nowhere near the 1.5. That gets us to the 2 to 3 degree increase here. It's only this one here that's consistent with it, and this gets us by, we have to be down to 90, that's that 90% reduction that keeps coming back. So this is what they call the ambition gap that we have to be on to move us down in this direction. And this is kind of where Canada gets this 40% trajectory on there. But if you get 40% by 2030, you've got to do another 40% to 50% off that by 2050. So John Holdren was at MIT, very famous climatologist that wrote an op-ed in the New York Times and basically said that we have three choices for humanity. We mitigate, we adapt, or we suffer. And his feeling is that we are going to need some of each, and the question is what the mix is right now. We've been very poor at mitigation. I would say we're really behind the 8 ball in terms of our ability to be able to adapt. And so it means that a lot of people are suffering and will continue to suffer, and this will increase. We would like to shift it more in this direction over here, but mitigation is really hard to do. So are we capable of doing this? This is a question I put out. Well, consumption and patterns of consumption, both energy tied to well-being, we really have to address that. We have to think in complex systems. I don't think we can take the 19th century view of how this works. We have to learn how to deal psychologically with uncertainty and not have it cripple us. and tie us up in all the court battles and things like this. We need to see the environment as an integral part of our social, cultural, political, and economic systems, not separate. We're embedded in this. Solutions need to be ethical, fair, just, and embody equity. I say this because I don't think it's, we need to really not become environmental imperialists in solving the problem, which is largely one the West has generated. We all need to act, and we need to act locally and have an influence of the global. And we need to maintain and sustain hope. And this is, there is a real issue with environmental anxiety right now. I am hopeful for the future. I'm not overly optimistic, but I am hopeful. But clearly, I don't think we can solve problems with the same thinking that we used that have created them. And this I've added in. This came out just yesterday. I'm sure you've all read it. I think it's 272 pages with its appendices. I've taken from the backgrounder. This is the emissions 2030 plan with a lot of hoopla that was announced yesterday. These are the websites that you can get it off here. But Canada's plan is to invest heavily in helping reduce energy costs for homes and buildings. That would conserve energy, empower communities to take climate action. That is to design smarter cities with public transportation, make it easier for Canadians to switch to electrical vehicles. They have a target of 35% of the population being in electric vehicles by 2030. Driving down the carbon pollution from the oil and gas sector. It is actually in the document, if you look at it, it's 31% by 2030. The 40% that you're hearing is from the 2009 value, not for. Power the economy with renewable electricity, help industries develop and adapt clean technologies on their journey to net zero. I'm not a big fan of net zero. I think it's maybe a cop-out for people to allow us to have high emissions and just offset them, and I don't think we can do that. Invest in nature and natural solutions. I do a lot of research on Canada's peatlands, and we should try and preserve. It's a huge carbon stock that we've got, and the forests. Support farmers. I think this is really important because a huge amount of emissions, and the ones that are low-hanging fruit, are the emissions of methane and nitrous oxide that come from the farming community. And clearly they're using a pricing of pollution approach with the carbon tax or cap and trade as a strategy to do this. So this document is an interesting one. We have had, I'll point out, 4 separate plans, and we have not acted on any of them. So this is the 5th one. Hopefully the political will there is to act on this. So I just want to end with giving you some summer reading to do to help you get through this problem. A great book is kind of overall thinker is Catherine Hayhoe, who is actually a Canadian. She lives in the United States. She wrote a really nice book that came out last year called Saving Us All. If you're suffering from climate anxiety, there's a really great field guide that's been produced for this. I do see there's a question from Claire.
Okay. As you were coming to the end, I was just hoping that you might talk a little bit more about governance between countries. And that seems to be a big problem of spending a lot of money on war and not working together. So perhaps something to do with the political system of the world might be improved?
Well, I mean, the Conference of Parties, which is what COP is, that was what happened on the in Glasgow. That was the 26th Conference of Party. The 27th one is happening this year. coming together. We've been very good at getting together and drawing up these plans about what we should do and how we should collectively act on it. We have no global governance system that exists. We all are nation states. So the question is, when you take those aspirations of what we want to see happen that are worked out in the international negotiations, how well are they acted on individual countries? And some countries are doing some pretty well on this. And I know I get myself in trouble when I say this, but in fact, our neighbors to the south are doing much better than we are here in Canada in reducing their emissions. Part of that is because they've gone to fracking, which you might want to argue whether that's a good thing or not. But they've also were producing a lot of energy by coal, and they're reducing that substantially. So, I don't know how you get international governance to work on these things, except for countries trying to work in unison on this. There's a well-known bunch of scenarios that people look at in terms of looking at people that agree to do things and then cheat. If you cheat and you're successful and everybody else does it, then it's kind of a version of prisoner's dilemma. And you have less that you have to do and you suffer less. So I think if we had the answer to global governance, we would be a lot further down the road. So I don't have, I'm a little bit jaded by all the COPs and the IPCC type of approaches, because we really haven't been able to do anything that effective. It may be that we've got to the point now that international embarrassment might be the primary driver for us to be able to do things. I don't know. So I see there's a question by Bacall. I am finished, so I think I have one more slide. So.
Yeah, hi there. Sorry, I just wanted to, okay, I'll put on my video. I don't know if my camera's working. Okay. So basically with in regards to what you were just talking about different governments, countries, sorry, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Okay. So like even with like Greta Thunberg and whatnot, like a couple years back, like what, 4 years ago, like even in Montreal, like it's about like raising awareness, making people realize it's a huge problem. Yep. Like climate change is a thing. The more you talk about it, the more the general public knows, yep. The more the world at large comes together and they do their own part. But also there's like summits, conferences, you get educated. The more you hear about stuff, the more you try and take action, Yeah.
My dog agrees with you.
Yeah. So like just like sustainability, like you can recycle. I mean, people should, I'm vegan, like I've been for most of my life.
Yeah, no, I agree with you, and I think we have to get mobilized on this, but we're not just trimming at the edges. The problem is massive for us to be able to do this, and we do think, a lot of people do think that we have technological fixes. So the slide I've got up now actually talks about a book called Ending Fossil Fuels by Holly Jean Buck. It's a fantastic book to read. It's very, very small, thin book to read, but it packs a real punch. And she goes after this net zero issue that we're dealing with. And so there are a number of things in the way that we operate in society that we cannot significantly reduce our emissions. So for example, we could probably reduce our emissions substantially for our individual vehicles by going electric, by going public transit electric, all those various different things. The jury's out about whether we can do that with aviation. We could do it by reducing substantially aviation, but the question is then, are people, is that within their tolerance zone to do this? But there are like thousands and thousands and thousands of ways that we can reduce things that we need to start doing. And we just need to start getting on this. I think public awareness is rising. I think why it's rising now is because people are actually getting a little bit scared about seeing these massive fires that we're seeing in Western Canada, the potential droughts that we're seeing with food production. I think these things are beginning to motivate people, and I think it's motivating people not necessarily out of wanting to see reductions in emissions, but they believe that reductions in emissions are the only way that they're going to avoid this degree of climate change. I think it's Tammy, I think. Your names are extremely small on my screen, so if I don't get the name, if I don't get the name right, cut me a break.
Okay. First, I wanted to say thank you for your time in the presentation. It's very refreshing to hear some cynicism in these presentations online, because I see so many and everyone is just very careful about not going against anyone and not saying anything that might not be politically correct. So on that, kudos. I'm so sorry to hear that you're very pessimistic about our future, though. But I do appreciate your tone and realism.
Well, I'm way beyond now being polite about this stuff and worrying about being politically correct about this stuff. We are in a crisis. We've got to move. Yeah. So.
And I agree that, you know, it's an individual and a collective issue. I'm taking a minor in law, and so I look at the question a lot from more of a kind of legal purview of trying to, you know, like, it's not that we're talking about environmentalism per se, but I'm seeing like these other issues that kind of revolve around it.
Yep.
And I can't help but wonder, you know, like when you look at the history of like different governmental structures, there's always like a hierarchy, right? And in that hierarchy right now, as it stands, it feels like governance isn't even very powerful anymore. So it kind of gets me thinking like that the king, if you wish, right now is in corporations because of the way that we created our legal structures to protect them, so that they basically have a position of personhood or all of the wonders of being an adult, you know, and being respected in those rights. But at the same time, without having to deal with all the consequences and being able to dissolve, move to another legal jurisdiction, follow the regulations in one country, put pressure on the other. So it's like, I hear the whole, like, we need to put public pressure, and that governance, you know, we talk a lot about policies and regulations and governments and whatnot. And I absolutely agree that these things do have to change, but I can't help but wonder that maybe we're not actually going high up enough in order to, you know, like when I hear, for example, that
I do have some views on this.
Yes.
And I do have some biases on this. We have a lawyer.
Like I would have had one example, for example, that I heard recently that, you know, really struck me as frustrating. Like the fact that, for example, monopolies of, you know, these corporations have access to our good water, but that we don't even have access to that information. I find that so problematic. It's like,
but the
so we
fact
don't
is
even have
the
our own.
The legal system can be used the other way around too. And there have been some very successful recent cases, not here in Canada, but there's a couple underway in the United States. There have been a couple that have been successful at the state level, and in European countries, in Germany and particularly in the Netherlands, where people have done effectively class action suits against the government and against corporations. And I think that we've seen this be successful. It takes a very, very long period of time. So if you look at the tobacco industry, you know, it took a long period of time, but it was a series of pretty celebrated class action cases that ended up making it financially imperative for those companies to deal with things. And we're in the same situation with now the oil companies, where they clearly had information about the consequences or the potential consequences for climate change, and didn't divulge that information. So I think that on the legal front, there is leverage that can happen on these type of things. It's easier in the United States because of third-party things here, but you know, in Canada, the class actions might motivate that. The problem is it's going to take a very, very long period of time to do that. The cases that happen in Europe moved much faster than they have in North America. So, that's some of the leverage that you would do there. I think you're right. I think that the corporate interest and the investment of the corporations in our political structure, I think many governments are quite neutered almost in the sense of being able to take action because of the way that international corporations operate. And the Canadian mining sector is a very, very good example of that. We put regulations in Canada, and what do? Is we go lots of other places and do lots of nasty things in other places.
And for the class action suits, I don't know how it is in Europe, but I just, right before this meeting, I was with Judge Nicole Duval, and she talked about environmentalism as well. And she mentioned the class action suits, but that there's a limited an issue with them because in Canada, apparently, the way a particular case was set up, the class action suits against these companies means that they also have to give up a certain like their own I don't know exactly, like I would have to reread it, but like the aspect of property, for example, for them, like that they're attacking one aspect but not the other. And so like apparently there's, I have to look into it, but she did mention that
it depends on what jurisdiction you're in. I think
Okay.
it's different. Class actions are quite different in structure here in Quebec than they are in various different places. BC has quite a different structure for class actions than does, for example, Ontario. And some are more successful than others. I'm not saying that it's the solution. I'm just saying that it might
be a way to address.
I think so. I can't see the first name, but Thomas, I think, is the last name. And then I have Francois. Is it Lapointe or?
François Labonte, yes.
Labonte. Okay, sorry. So I'll take you second. Thomas is. I can't see the.
Would it be okay to remove the screen share so that we could go back to like a gallery space and
Well,
see the images bigger?
I have the gallery on mine.
Okay.
I have the gallery on mine. I took the screen share off, but that doesn't change anything on my screen. So. Okay.
His name is Urs. U-R-S, Thomas.
Okay. Urs. I can see the last name, but I can't see Urs. But okay, so you need to go off mute, Urs, to be able to ask the question. You're muted. You're muted. Urs, you are muted. I can't hear you.
Yeah, Urs, you have to unmute. No, we still can't hear you.
Should be in the bottom left of your screen.
Urs, you've got the mute on. Turn it off.
Well, the host could unmute everybody. That would be one way of doing it.
I don't think I can unmute. I can ask all to unmute, but I can't unmute.
Christine, if you right-click on Urs,
So
and
why
then
don't
you can ask him to unmute specifically.
Yeah.
Or hold the space bar down.
I've already asked him to unmute. I think he's stuck. Why don't you go ahead and speak to Francois and I'll try to get Urs unmuted. Okay. Urs, we'll come back to you.
This brings back memories of March 2020 when we suddenly went to Zoom, where you'd have 150 students online. So. Go ahead, Francois.
Yeah, well, thank you for the presentation. Quite interesting. One thing, though, I noticed on your slide of solutions or potential solutions and the huge increase of 60% needed in electricity, 150% in nuclear. But what about your statement that says huge increase in biofuels and carbon capture technologies.
Yeah.
I'm a bit skeptical about this idea of carbon capture technologies and how it might help, but I definitely would love to, if you could share your comments and your views.
Yeah. No,
on those technologies.
No, if I didn't say it at the time when I was saying it, the problem with those technologies right now is that we haven't got them to go to scale at all. I mean, we've got a number.
I'll try to. How do I do that?
We have a number of demonstration sites in Iceland, and there's one actually in Western Canada, in Weyburn, Saskatchewan, where yes, the technology is there and it's quite successful in doing it, but it's not at scale at all. I mean, it is imperceptible amount of CO2 that we're removing. And this is one of the reasons why I'm not a big fan of the net zero view of the world, because the net zero view of the world is that we emit now, and it's on the basis that we will have the technologies to remove the stuff down the road that will grow a whole bunch of trees and all these types of things. And they delay the problem. They don't solve the problem right now. And we need some immediate solutions. I also think that we have limited capacity, not zero capacity, but we have limited capacity to really deal with the biofuel as a solution on these things. I think there are a number of things that we can do, and particularly if we're using biofuel from the waste stream of other things. But the problem is that most of that biofuel, the substrate that we would use to build the biofuel, are low density and need to be transported quite a significant distance to be able to make the biofuels viable in an economic sense to be able to produce them. And so this is the problem I have with ethanol in the United States. You know, the research is very, very clear on corn ethanol is that we are producing more CO2 transporting the corn to the ethanol plants than we are saving back by putting ethanol in the fuel. So it's a little bit bogus when you look at it that way. So I will caution you, though, is that in those trajectories that I put on there, that I had on the side of the lines that go down, they have a very optimistic view of carbon capture technologies and also biofuels in them. So if those are over optimistic, what it means is that the other things that we are in the top part is that we're not looking at 90% reduction, we're looking at 95% reduction in fossil fuels that we need to do. And that ups everything else in terms of the energy production. But the one thing I really want to stress is that there's a view in the world, and we were given this view, basically the constraint that we had to operate inside the United Nations Environment Program by the countries that set up the conference to parties for the IPCC to operate within, is that there are a bunch of social, economic, political scenarios that are given to the scientists, and then the economists give us the emissions that go along with this, what the possibilities are. If I was I'm not an economist at all, I'm a scientist, which means I tend to be pretty out of touch with the political realities of what goes on in the world. And plus I work in a university, which is even more distancing us from reality. But, you know, let's assume we're in my class and I can talk freely about this. What I think we need to be doing right off the bat is thinking about how do we get our front-end consumption down. I mean, we have a problem in the sense that our economy is tied to energy consumption, and energy is tied to fossil fuels. Now, is there a way we can redesign or alter the economy in some sort of way that we do it, that we minimize our consumption? And I'll give you an example of this. There's a great book written by a couple of behavioral economists, I think from the University of Chicago, called Nudge. And there's a chapter in there on environment. in that book, A Nudge. And there was I think it's 1,000 Oaks, which is in just outside Los Angeles. And they did a little bit of an experiment on this, on energy reduction. So the first thing they did is on people's panels that you get, they had the meter, and they put the meter up, and they had and everybody sees the kilowatt hours and all that kind of stuff, and nobody knows what the hell that means. So then what they did is that they actually put on the meters the price and the cost that people had in their house. And when they did that, they found that they actually got about a 10% reduction in consumption when they let people know the price that the price that was happening on that. But where they got the huge reduction, and this is where they call the chapter Not Keeping Up with the Joneses, is what they did is that they put on the meters the average for the neighborhood. So what you saw is you saw your energy consumption, and then you saw the neighborhood energy consumption, and people that were all above that went, oh, I am, I'm not socially being responsible. So that started reducing their energy reduction, which reduced the average down, which further ratcheted the thing down. And that reduction alone, by doing that, when they interviewed people afterwards, the communities that were being metered got the energy consumption down 40%. And they were asked, what was the negative impact on you, on your lifestyle and your well-being? And they said, absolutely none.
Yeah.
So that means that we have a lot of slack within this system if we can find the levers to motivate people to do these types of things, right? So, but that requires a lot of government intervention. It requires some kind of benevolent paternalism to get these things going. But I mean, that suggests to me that we have huge amounts of automobiles alone. Even if you stay with the gas-powered vehicles, we have tremendous gains that we can get already with the technology we have to reduce emissions and fuel consumption. We just haven't put the economic levers in place to be able to force people to do this or to respond in that sort of way. So I think, I do think all the projections we've done are looking at way too much consumption as a given to start with up front. And so I think if we ratchet that down, then what we're doing is getting within the range that some of the alternatives might catch up enough, some of these other things to do. But you're absolutely correct. There's a lot of very unrealistic expectations, I think, out of things like carbon capture. I think people in Canada think we're going to do great with natural climate solutions. There's only so many trees that you can plant, and the land that you're planting it on, the more you need land, the more valuable that land becomes. And so the cost of it goes way, way up because you're now needing a valuable resource of land to plant the trees on. So. Yeah.
Thank you.
So I think you're right. I think so it needs a lot of different sectors to work all in the kind of same direction to reduce stuff. So.
Okay, can we see if I can get Urs to can you unmute
Yes,
Urs? Oh, good.
Now.
Okay.
Can you hear me?
I can hear you. I can hear yours.
Excellent. Yes, I'm glad you emphasized the political aspects of this whole issue. And obviously it starts with voting. When voting time comes, you remember the party's priorities, and generally speaking, it's usually the left that is more interested in climate change than the right. Not only that, there are also lots of NGOs, non-governmental organizations that you can support. Some are tax deductible and some are not. Greenpeace is not. So that's I think the most important thing you can do about climate change. And when it comes to emphasizing, preaching, so to speak, about climate change, there is a huge difference, a huge problem that doesn't exist, for instance, in COVID or other diseases like that. In COVID, if you follow the general medical recommendations, you do yourself a favor. You will reduce the probability that you get sick. There is unfortunately no such thing in climate change.
Right.
You can do whatever you want it's completely useless to think that it really affects the climate.
Well,
Because
even if we all got together right now, everybody, and we had a consensus and we did it, it would be our grandchildren that would be
that's it.
reaping the benefits.
Exactly.
Yeah, so that intergenerational that's a serious problem.
Yeah,
and I also think that the political structure of voting every 3 to 4 years for people is not conducive to long range planning.
Yeah.
Yeah, there was a very famous Al Gore talks about this when Michael Mann went on the Hill and was testifying before Senate, and he did these presentations of climate cycles and everything like this, and the senator Iowa leaned over and said, "Son, the only cycles on this hill that matter are 2 and 4 years." So unless you can frame all your questions within 2 and 4 year cycles, you're not going to influence people in the Senate, which is a pretty sad reflection of how the system works.
Okay, so I'm just going to say that we've got about 10 minutes left, so time for the 3 questions that are there maybe, and then
So I've got I think Mike Nickerson have been waiting for a while, so yeah.
Okay, well, thank you very much. I'm listening to lots of these things, and you've scoped it very nicely. The metering story is quite fascinating. That's I just heard a very little bit of that some time ago. But the point that's not generally brought up, and I think is an omission, is cultural. Before the industrial age made it necessary for us to become consumers and spend all our time earning money to buy stuff, which is what is behind the climate crisis, is this great industrial production. We made friends, we learned stuff, we played games, we enjoyed the world around us. The things that we did with our lives was the center of culture as compared to the consumptive cycle. So part of the solution is to encourage people to become more involved in what they can do with their lives and less in what they do with the material stuff. We use the phrase more fun, less stuff.
I couldn't agree with you more. I mean, I think that we have a materialistic society, and I think the materialism that we have is satisfaction on that is extremely short-lived. I mean, I think the things, the connections to families, your community, those types of things are much more rewarding in the way that we live. I mean, how much junk do we need? I mean, we've got, you look around your house, it's just you could cut it 50%, 80%, you'd probably be perfectly happy the way that you operate, right? So I think that the materialistic basis of things that we've done this, but it's the way we reward ourselves and the way we operate, right? And so I'm with you on this. I think that you do need a big change. So there's John Cowan.
Yes, thank you for your presentation. And in the same theme of materialism, I see what I would think is not enough focus on the consumer and his and her role. Do you see any possibility that individuals will be given carbon budgets for themselves, or let alone rations? I mean, rationing is the ultimate thing that we've done in wartime when there were shortages of products, of necessary things, but at least giving us carbon budgets that we have to live within, whether it's in an airplane or in our car or in our house.
Yeah, I think right now the way that the view of doing that is doing it in a distributive model where you actually do it on taxation. And so it's based on the things that you consume that would have a carbon price that's attached to them. And the idea is that economic lever would reduce your consumption. I actually think that's very misguided because if you just look at the price of gasoline right now, it is having an impact on some people in the way that they operate, but it really doesn't change our habits any much. And it's also not a very equitable way of going about doing this, in the sense that there are people that are lower income that are really disadvantaged in the way that the way we do it. I mean, the idea of individual carbon budgets is really useful. I have a little lecture that I do in my class on, and I've done it ever since I started teaching the very large environmental course, first year course. I love teaching that course because you're like kind of a missionary when you start teaching this course and you're trying to get people to think about it. One of the things I got students to do, and I still do, is I get them to do an environmental footprint. There's tons of them that are available on the web. We put them on there. I remember the first time I did it, the students started, they hand them in electronically now, but this was 20 years ago that they were doing it. And the students, they were environmental students, and they would hand their assignments in envelopes as opposed to putting them in the stack, because the calculator I had printed out the number of Earths that you would need to be able to sustain them if everybody on Earth had their consumption habits. And they were so embarrassed that they put them in envelopes to hand them in because they didn't want their colleagues to see that. I mean, there are now some very, very, very good carbon calculators that you can get on the web, where you can calculate your own carbon footprint. And the thing that's really good about those, if you're inclined to do it, is you can actually see where you can get your gains. It's where you can really make your reductions in some of your habits that would help us reduce. Getting it to the point that we get some agreement across society that we actually do that and we have our own carbon budgets, it would probably work. I'm not really sure how that would work. I loathe to say this, but I actually think open democratic societies are a disaster for the environment in many ways, because we need a benevolent dictator who would put your carbon footprint budget requirements in place. And it would have to be fair and equitable across the board, and you have to get everybody seeing what's happening. I'm not sure that is ever going to happen in a country that you've got people voting for people in power. I don't know. So I think I've seen Tammy's got her hand back up again. Okay.
Yeah, I had a lot of, like, for starters, I think Nudge was by Richard Taylor, which is on choice architecture, which is interesting that you bring it up. I didn't read it yet, but it's the second time that I've been told that this would be a good, way, because I actually wonder, like, how the fact that we have a difficulty projecting, how do you get people to change when they can't actually relate to the problem in any substantial way? So I find that that's a good point.
I think the NDP had a good idea in Ontario when I was living in teaching at York University, which is now 30 years ago. During one of the campaigns, they tongue-in-cheek suggested, I think it might have been Bob Ray that actually suggested it. It was when we were having trouble finding landfill sites around Toronto, and the idea was trucking it all up to New Liskeard and putting it all in the old mines up there. I think Ray said his suggestion is that we have to bury all our garbage in our own backyard. And that would certainly have the consequences of you reducing your garbage.
That actually would that's actually more or less what we're doing, not the actual garbage, but like we do a lot of composting. So it's, and anything that can be recycled, we try to find ways that reuse it instead of like putting in the recycling bin. So you kind of become very aware of all that stuff that is accumulated. So we do a cleanup of that recycle that we didn't find anything to do. So we become more conscientious of.
Yeah, no, I think that's good. And I think
interesting as a.
we're not now even doing, many communities are actually now doing pickups of the degradable food waste and those types of things. So they're using them as compost, but compost actually produces a fair bit of greenhouse gas emissions. And if you don't do it right, it produces methane. which is one of the things I spent a lot of part of my career looking at.
It,
So,
it certainly does then. It
That's
appears
right,
that we
that's
came to
right.
that conclusion pretty fast.
yeah, and the other thing too is
Like,
I'm a little bit worried about leaving that up to the individual citizens, because we actually have quite a bit of waste that can be quite toxic if not disposed of the proper way. And I'm not sure that people really know those kinds of things to do. So it's a little bit, again, it's where you need your benevolent.
the better education for the individual. I mean, this isn't stuff that they teach you in school, so it's something that they should be teaching more, right? Because
Well, I'm all in favor of education.
not just at university, obviously. And actually, the referral to the idea of taxing, it made me think of, I think that they have a way to, like, it's not necessarily carbon, but it's regarding like gray water, for example, and trying to reduce the amount of energy that we use in general. That was being like, these mechanisms are in place. We're finding like, you know, those heaters that heat the water as you use it instead of the big tanks that you usually have in these apartments and buildings. But these things are really generally not accessible. I wonder if, like, you know, environmental solutions, instead of taxing people, is sort of like the electric car, you know, compensating or rewarding people so that it becomes more accessible to have, you know, certain, or even making it compulsory that houses need to have.
Well, the other
like,
thing too is if you tax people, the people that can afford the taxes don't reduce their consumption. They just pay for it, right? So that doesn't obtain the objective that you want.
Yeah, but it's a complicated problem.
All right, so I'm going
That's
to,
why we haven't found the solutions yet. But you got to keep talking about them, right?
it's great to have seen this turnout. Thank you, Nigel. Patricia, did you have a word or two to say?
Well, I'm just going to say, Nigel, I saw your presentation a couple of months ago when you gave the presentation to the Montreal Field Naturalist Club. And I thought it would be a good talk for our World Feds. So thank you so much. I like your slides showing a historical perspective on how our current crisis with, well, I called it crisis with our environmental issues can be certainly measured along the way. I think the way you presented the material from the slides and expanded on that gave us more of an appreciation for some of the considerations we need to be looking at. So instead of going on longer than that, I just want to say a huge thank you to your time and your presentation. And we do wish to thank you profusely for giving us this opportunity. Thanks very much, Nigel.
My pleasure.
Good.
And thank you everyone for coming. Just before we sign off, just a reminder that we've got a couple of other events coming up. April 1st, presentation on the war in Ukraine and UN reform with Andrew Carswell. And April 12th, Greening the World Economy for a Sustainable Future with Seth Klein. So if you are interested in either of those, just have a look at our events page for the World Federalists and come again. It's funny when we're not there in person, we're there in Zoom.
Yes.
So thank you very much, everyone.
And thanks for everybody's participation. Thank you.
Yeah.
Thanks so much.
Bye-bye.
Thank you, Nigel.
All right, thank you.
Bye-bye.
July.